There is a moment in the story of Chernobyl that almost nobody talks about, and it is the moment that makes the disaster not just a tragedy, but a crime. It happens not at 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 exploded. It happens years before that, in the offices and institutes of Soviet nuclear science, where engineers and physicists looked at the design of the RBMK reactor, the reactor that would eventually destroy itself and poison a continent, and saw the flaws. They saw them, they understood them, they wrote reports about them, and then they buried those reports, certified the reactor as safe, built 17 of them across the Soviet Union, and sent operators to run them without telling those operators what the reactor was actually capable of doing under the wrong conditions. The explosion at Chernobyl on April 26, 1986, was not a surprise in the way that disasters are supposed to be surprises. It was the expression of known physics operating through a known flaw in a known design, in a system built by an institution that had decided its international reputation was worth more than the truth about its own technology. That is the story that this video is going to tell. Not just what the flaws were, but how they worked, why the Soviet state concealed them, and what it cost. In lives, in land, in the slow destruction of one man who tried to tell the truth about what he knew. That man was Valery Legasov. But we will get to him. First, the reactor. The RBMK 1000 was a Soviet design, developed in the 1960s and built throughout the Soviet Union from the early 1970s onward. By the time of the Chernobyl disaster, 17 RBMK reactors were operating across the USSR, at Chernobyl in Ukraine, at Leningrad, at Kursk, at Smolensk. The design was, in some respects, genuinely innovative. It allowed fuel rods to be changed while the reactor was still running at full power, a feature that made it highly practical for continuous electricity generation. It used lightly enriched uranium, which was cheaper to produce than the more enriched fuel needed for other reactor designs. It generated enormous amounts of electricity at a fraction of the cost of Western reactor designs. And it was built without a full external containment structure. The thick concrete and steel shell that surrounds reactors in the United States and Western Europe, and is designed to contain a catastrophic failure before it reaches the outside world. Full containment structures would have more than doubled the cost and construction time of each plant. The Soviet nuclear authorities had certified the RBMK design as inherently safe when operated within established parameters, and on that basis, they decided containment was unnecessary. The reactor could not fail catastrophically. Therefore, a structure to contain a catastrophic failure was not required. That circular reasoning would stand for 20 years, until the reactor proved it wrong. Beneath the practical engineering decisions, though, the RBMK had 3 design characteristics that were not just unusual, but were, in the judgment of every nuclear authority outside the Soviet Union, dangerous. These 3 flaws worked independently, and also compounded each other, and understanding them is understanding exactly why Reactor 4 exploded on April 26, 1986. The first and most fundamental flaw was what physicists call the positive void coefficient. To understand what this means, you need to understand a little about how nuclear reactors are controlled. In a nuclear reactor, uranium atoms split, a process called fission, releasing energy and neutrons. Those neutrons then strike other uranium atoms, causing more splits, releasing more energy and more neutrons. This chain reaction is what generates heat. That heat boils water, the steam turns a turbine, and electricity is produced. This is called a negative void coefficient, and it is a fundamental safety requirement for nuclear reactors in the United States and Western Europe. Reactors are not permitted to have a positive void coefficient. The RBMK had a positive void coefficient. In the RBMK, water was not the moderator, the substance that slowed neutrons to the speed needed for efficient fission. That role was performed by the graphite that surrounded the fuel channels. The water in the RBMK was a neutron absorber, but because graphite was doing the moderating, the water's role in the overall system was different. When water heated up and formed steam bubbles, when voids appeared, the neutron absorption decreased, just as in other reactors. But in the RBMK, because graphite was continuing to moderate the neutrons regardless of what the water was doing, those freed neutrons caused more fissions rather than fewer. The chain reaction accelerated. More fissions produced more heat. More heat produced more steam bubbles. More steam bubbles freed more neutrons. More neutrons caused more fissions. The system did not self-correct. It ran away. At low power levels, below approximately 20% of full capacity, this instability became extreme. The reactor became extraordinarily sensitive to small changes, capable of sudden, uncontrolled power surges that no operator could manually correct in time. This property of the reactor was not in the operating manuals available to the crews. It was not in the safety briefings. The operators at Chernobyl, the men in the control room on the night of April 26, 1986, did not know their reactor behaved this way. The people who designed it knew. The people who certified it knew. The operators did not know because telling them would have required admitting that the reactor had a flaw the Soviet nuclear establishment had decided not to acknowledge. The second flaw was in the control rods, the physical mechanism by which operators controlled the chain reaction. Control rods in a nuclear reactor are inserted into the core to absorb neutrons and slow the reaction. They are pulled out to allow the reaction to accelerate. They are the primary tool operators use to manage a reactor's power level, and in an emergency, inserting them quickly is the mechanism by which a reactor is shut down. This emergency insertion is called a scram. The RBMK's control rods were made of boron carbide, a neutron absorber, at their upper portions. This is standard. The boron absorbs neutrons and slows the reaction. But the lower portions of each control rod, the sections that entered the core first when a rod was inserted, were made of graphite. Graphite is a neutron moderator, not an absorber. It speeds reactions rather than slowing them. The design intention was that the graphite section would displace water from the channel as the rod entered, removing some of the water's neutron absorption and replacing it with graphite moderation before the boron carbide arrived to do the real work of slowing the reaction. In normal operation, at normal power levels, this design quirk had minimal practical effect. But in the conditions present on the night of April 26, 1986, low power, high xenon poisoning, a positive void coefficient already pushing the system toward instability, the effect was catastrophic. When operators pressed the AZ5 button, the emergency shutdown button, 211 control rods began descending into the core simultaneously. The graphite tips entered first. For approximately 3 seconds, as the rods descended and the graphite sections displaced water in the lower portions of the core, the reaction did not slow, it accelerated. The emergency shutdown button, the button that was supposed to stop the reactor, momentarily increased the reactor's power output in the most vulnerable portion of the core in a system that was already running toward a runaway. 3 seconds, that was how long it took for the boron carbide sections to arrive and begin absorbing neutrons. 3 seconds was long enough. By the time the boron arrived, the power surge in the lower core had already exceeded what the fuel and the cooling channels could contain. The operators who pressed the AZ5 button did not know the control rods would do this. The briefings did not say it. The operating procedures did not mention it. The phenomenon had a name, the positive scram effect, and it was known to the reactor's designers. It had been identified. It had been analyzed. A memo written at the Kurchatov Institute, the institution that designed the RBMK, had noted the danger. That memo did not reach the operators. It did not reach the plant directors. It was classified. The positive scram effect remained in the files of the people who built the reactor, while the people who ran the reactor pressed buttons whose consequences they did not understand. The third flaw was the absence of a containment structure. This was not a hidden flaw. It was a visible one, obvious to any Western engineer who looked at the plant's design. RBMK reactors had no full external containment, no reinforced concrete shell capable of trapping radioactive material in the event of a core failure. When Reactor 4 exploded, there was nothing between the burning graphite and radioactive fuel fragments and the open sky above Chernobyl, except the structural pieces of the building that the explosion itself had already partially destroyed. The material that was released in the first days of the fire, the cesium-137, the iodine-131, the strontium-90, the plutonium, went directly into the atmosphere. An estimated 400 times more radioactive material was released than by the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If the RBMK had been built with the containment structure that Western reactor designs required, the explosion would still have occurred. The reactor would still have been destroyed. But the containment might have held. The radioactive material might not have reached the sky. Pripyat might not have been evacuated. The red forest might not have turned red. The cloud might not have drifted across Europe. The cost of not building containment was not a cost anyone paid in 1970 when the decision was made. It was a cost that 600,000 liquidators paid with their health, and that the residents of Pripyat and the surrounding villages paid with their homes, and that thousands of children in Ukraine and Belarus paid with thyroid cancer, and that the global nuclear industry paid with its reputation for a generation. Now understand where the concealment lives in the story, because the concealment is not a single act. It is a sustained institutional posture, maintained across decades by people who understood exactly what they were protecting. The RBMK design was built, certified, and operated in the Soviet Union, while every other nuclear power nation on Earth declined to use it. The United States would not license a reactor with a positive void coefficient. The design was known outside the Soviet Union to have characteristics that made it unlike anything Western regulators would permit. Inside the Soviet Union, the official position was that the reactor was safe when operated within parameters, and that any accident would be the fault of operators who deviated from those parameters, not the fault of the design. This position was not ignorance, it was policy. The Soviet nuclear establishment, centered at the Kurchatov Institute, represented internationally by physicists who knew the reactor's behavior at low power, had made a collective decision to certify safety rather than to engineer it. The decision was economic. Full containment structures cost too much. A negative void coefficient required more expensive fuel enrichment. Redesigning the control rods to eliminate the positive scram effect required admitting that the existing design had a critical flaw. None of these costs were acceptable to an institution that had built 17 reactors on the existing design, and that was planning to build more. Valery Legasov arrived at Chernobyl on April 26, 1986, hours after the explosion. He had not been sent because he was a reactor specialist. He was an inorganic chemist, a specialist in physical chemistry and noble gases, serving as first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute. He was sent partly because most of his colleagues were unreachable when the emergency call came through the closed state telephone line called the Vertushka. He arrived in Pripyat and immediately grasped what had happened. He spent the next 4 months living and working in and around the exclusion zone, coordinating containment efforts, watching men do what men were sent to do in an emergency that should not have been possible. He received a high radiation dose that he would carry for the rest of his life. He was, by the account of people who knew him, a changed man when he finally left. In August 1986, Legasov was chosen to present the Soviet delegation's report to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. The choice of Legasov was contested within the Soviet nuclear establishment, because some feared he would be difficult to control. Their fear was partially justified. Legasov's report was a 5-hour oral presentation. The Vienna conference hall, by all accounts, falling into complete silence from the 15th minute onward. He described the RBMK design and its characteristics. He acknowledged the positive void coefficient. He acknowledged the control rod design. He described the sequence of events on the night of April 26th with a precision and honesty that no Western expert had expected from a Soviet representative. When he finished, the hall gave him a standing ovation. The international nuclear community recognized that a Soviet scientist had told them more truth about this disaster than they had expected to hear. His report was praised as remarkably candid. What Legasov did not say in Vienna, what the KGB had pressured him to omit, what the Soviet nuclear establishment had insisted could not be disclosed, was the full extent to which the RBMK design was known to be unsafe before the accident. He described the flaws as they had expressed themselves at Chernobyl. He did not say that those flaws had been identified, documented, and concealed for years before any explosion occurred. He did not say that the operators who pressed the AZ-5 button had not been told about the positive scram effect because the people who designed the reactor had decided not to tell them. He was candid about the what, he was constrained about the when, and the who knew. Back in Moscow, the reaction to Legasov's Vienna performance was not gratitude. It was institutional hostility. He had gone further than the establishment wanted. He had said things that made the reactor designers uncomfortable. At the Kurchatov Institute, a vote was held on whether to reappoint Legasov to the Scientific and Technical Council, the body he had served on as deputy director. The vote was 129 to 100 against him. The institution whose reactor had just caused the worst nuclear disaster in history voted to exclude from its governing council the man who had spent 4 months of his life trying to contain the consequences of that disaster. He was, in the word used by his friend the journalist Vladimir Gubarev, exiled. Gubarev later said of the Kurchatov Institute, "I felt like saying to them that Legasov never left Chernobyl, but how come I did not see you there?" Legasov spent the next 2 years writing. He produced handwritten journals and audio recordings. Detailed, meticulous, the account of a man who understood that he was dying and that the things he knew needed to outlast him. He described the RBMK's known design flaws. He described the institutional decisions that had kept those flaws from reaching the operators. He described the gap between what the Soviet nuclear establishment knew and what it had told the people who ran its reactors. He recorded 5 audio tapes. He hid them. The KGB was watching, and he put the tapes in the ventilation system of his house, behind a panel where they would survive if something happened to him, available to whoever came looking. He had been warning about the safety problems of RBMK reactors for years before the disaster, his daughter Inga confirmed, and had offered to secure the reactors with protective containment shields. The proposal was denied. He went to the Politburo meeting on July 3, 1986, where the causes of the accident were discussed, and Gorbachev was told the truth. Gorbachev was furious. He accused the designers of covering up dangerous problems with the Soviet nuclear industry for decades. On April 27, 1988, exactly 2 years and 1 day after the explosion at Chernobyl, Valery Legasov hanged himself in his Moscow apartment. He left no suicide note. He left the tapes. He had been denied the Hero of Socialist Labor Award given to every other member of the Chernobyl response team. His health was deteriorating from radiation exposure. His career had been ended by the institution he had served for decades. His attempts to promote nuclear safety reform had been rebuffed at every level. And he had spent 2 years knowing what he knew, knowing what the reactor was, knowing what the operators had not been told, knowing what the concealment had cost, and carrying that knowledge in a system that did not want it spoken. His death made the tapes impossible to ignore. They were found. They were published. The full account of what Legasov knew when he knew it, and what the Soviet nuclear establishment had done with that knowledge, became part of the historical record. The RBMK reactors that continued operating after Chernobyl were retrofitted. The control rods were redesigned to eliminate the graphite tip problem. The void coefficient was reduced through changes to fuel enrichment and the addition of fixed neutron absorbers. The minimum safe number of control rods inserted during operation was raised and strictly enforced. These were all changes that the Soviet nuclear establishment had known were necessary before April 26, 1986, and had not made, because making them would have required admitting that the existing design was dangerous. 40 years later, the RBMK reactors that were not shut down after Chernobyl continue to operate in Russia, at Leningrad, at Kursk, at Smolensk. In February 2026, the Russian nuclear regulator approved a 5-year life extension for Leningrad Unit 4, authorizing it to operate until 2031. In 2026, it was reported that the RBMK units at the Kursk plant had undergone significant safety upgrades, with risk reportedly reduced by almost 100 times. Those upgrades are real. The retrofitted reactors are genuinely safer than the reactor that destroyed itself at Chernobyl. The graphite tip problem has been corrected. The void coefficient has been reduced. The minimum rod requirements are enforced. What has not been corrected, what cannot be retrofitted or regulated or reduced by almost 100 times, is the institutional culture that produced the concealment in the first place. The culture that certified a reactor safe because admitting it was unsafe was too expensive. That evaluated the cost of not building containment and decided the saving was worth the risk. That classified the memo about the positive scram effect rather than telling the operators. That voted 129 to 100 to exile the man who told the truth. Legasov wrote in his tapes, "In all my life, it never occurred to me that I would have to start this part of my life. At least not at the age that I currently am, just into my 50s. I have to start the part where I create my memoir. And this part is tragic, confusing, and incomprehensible." He was 51 when he recorded those words. He was dead at 51, exactly 2 years after the explosion. And the system that had sent operators to run a reactor without telling them what it could do in the wrong conditions, and then voted to exile the man who explained why that had been wrong, continued operating its reactors and extending their licenses for decades afterward. The fatal flaw of the title is not just the positive void coefficient. It is not just the graphite tips on the control rods. It is not just the missing containment structure. Those are the engineering flaws, and they are real, and they are documented, and they caused the explosion. The fatal flaw underneath all of them is the decision, made by people who knew and chose not to say, that the truth about a dangerous machine was less valuable than the institution that built it. That flaw has no retrofitted fix. It can only be corrected by institutional cultures that make a different choice. And the story of Valery Legasov, who made the different choice and paid for it with his career and his life, and left tapes hidden in a ventilation system so that the truth would survive him, is the evidence that choosing differently, in an institution that does not want you to, is the most difficult thing a scientist can do. The 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster falls this week on April 26, 2026. The exclusion zone is still uninhabitable. The sarcophagus is still standing. The liquidators who survived are still sick. Their dosimetry records still falsified. Their claims still contested. And the Leningrad reactor runs until 2031. If this channel, honest history told completely without softening the parts that matter most, is what brought you here, please subscribe. I will see you in the next video.